And a couple of rules of engagement before we get going this morning. All participants have been muted, and we want you to please remain on mute unless the TAO staff member unmutes you and calls on you to talk. You may ask or respond to questions in the chat box publicly or privately by directing your message to Kara Snow. And we'll ask you all to engage via the participant icon on your screen. We'll monitor the chat box and respond throughout the discussion. And please engage with us on social media. If you want to take a screenshot of myself and Andrew during our conversation and share those are always going to get a reshare from us. Due to the large number of participants and the limited time, we'll capture all questions in the chat and shift any unanswered ones to Mobilize, the TAO member engagement platform. Mobilize is TAO's member-only virtual community, and we'll post any unanswered questions from our members there, which means that's where you'll see the answers. It helps us keep the conversation going after the event. And if you have any questions about joining Mobilize, please contact Justin Martinez with TAO, whose email is on the screen. And if you have any questions about joining TAO to access this new member benefit, please reach out to membership@techoregon.org. TAO staff support is provided by Kara and Justin. Please reach out to them with feedback, questions, comments, or interest in sponsoring. A big thanks as well to Packstar and their CEO, Peggy Miller. She's been a big supporter of this series, and we really appreciate her support. Join us Tuesday, May 12th, for a special session with Dr. Ben Michaelis for wellness strategies for entrepreneurs and execs. We're really pleased to be able to capture some of his time. He's really well known, does a lot of work nationally. He's based out of New York. And then it's my pleasure now to introduce Andrew Phelps. He's the director of the Oregon Office of Emergency Management. And in addition to owning the response to an emergency or disaster, Andrew's office oversees the state's 911 system, and he also serves as the governor's authorized representative and state coordinating officer for disaster declarations. Andrew has a background as a first responder, and he's quite theatrically inclined, including a stint as a toy soldier at FAO Schwartz, which is a nice blend of his talents. Thanks for joining us today, Andrew, and we might as well jump right into questions.
So I'm just now regretting putting some of that stuff on my LinkedIn profile, but thank you, Skip. Appreciate that.
I think it's awesome. Now for a while, anyone who's on this call, when they ever see you or correspond, they're going to be like, by the way, that's awesome. You were a toy soldier at FAO Schwartz. Awesome.
Hey, you know, variety is the spice of life, I guess. And there's actually
Exactly.
strange overlaps between that and what I do now. So,
of course. We'll explore those a little later. I was wondering if you could first start by describing what your role and responsibilities are as the director of the Oregon Office of Emergency Management.
Yeah, so emergency management in general, it's definitely much more management most of the time than it is an emergency. It's plan development, training and exercise development, grant management. My office oversees tens of millions of dollars annually in federal preparedness, mitigation, and recovery grants, mostly through the federal government with a few multi-million-dollar state grant programs as well. I think that's why they never make movies about emergency managers. It's very administrative, paperwork heavy, and pushing dollars around to get them into communities to help the people that they do make movies about our firefighters, police officers, EMS workers, and of course supporting now during the COVID pandemic our frontline healthcare workers. So it's a lot of coordination. Emergency managers, the best emergency managers I tend to think, don't know everything, but they have the phone numbers for the people that do know everything. So when we have a bad day, we try to bring all of our partners into our emergency coordination center, or when there's social distancing restrictions like we have now, it's virtually convening a lot of these folks and making sure that the right connections are being made across all levels of government, interdisciplinary connections, and understanding that really at the government level, every agency at every level of government has a role to play. And also the recognition that we can't do a whole heck of a lot on our own. We rely really heavily on the private sector to solve a lot of the challenges we have, especially in terms of critical infrastructure, supply chain, resilience, and then also our ability to communicate with the public. Every emergency is a public information emergency, has been my experience, and our ability to get timely and accurate information out to the public so that you, your families, and your communities can make good decisions based on what's happening in a given emergency is really one of the most important things we do during our bad days. And I think this coronavirus pandemic has been a really good example of that. the number of folks that have gotten sick in Oregon, the number of folks that have gotten hospitalized is relatively low. But being able to get information out to the public, especially in a dynamic environment where things are changing and guidance is changing, and we're learning new things about how this virus is transmitted and how it impacts people every day. Our ability to get information out to people throughout the state and across the country, I think has made a huge difference in the impact that this virus has had.
That's great. So for organizations that are thinking about, how do they respond to an emergency or really any sort of a crisis, like what are some of the top things that they should be thinking about, based on your experience?
Yeah, so, I think this draws a little bit on my background as a firefighter and a search and rescue technician and emergency medical technician. You have to take care of yourself and your team first. When you're showing up to an emergency or managing an emergency, you have to remember that you need to be part of the solution, not add to the problem. So making sure that your staff and your team is taken care of is always priority number one for us. Using this current pandemic as sort of the lens to view staff care and self-care. If we're not practicing social distancing, if we're not practicing proper hygiene and taking care of our folks, we're going to have huge impacts to our ability to respond and manage the disaster. So making sure that your staff is taken care of, that they have the information and the tools and the resources they need to take care of themselves and be part of the solution, it becomes job number one for us. I think the other piece is looking at what we need to do, what you would need to do to stabilize the incident and maintain continuity of operations. Whether it's government or the private sector, there's always critical things that you have to do to maintain functionality. Ideally, you'd have some of that mapped out beforehand through a continuity of operations or business disaster recovery plan. And those will help identify what can be paused with your operations, but what are some of the critical things that you have to be able to maintain throughout a disaster, whether it's a pandemic, a winter storm, a long-term utility outage, or a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. For us in state government, if there's a disaster, we can't stop providing emergency food services to vulnerable populations. We can't stop sending out unemployment payments to folks that were previously unemployed or impacted by the disaster. These are all those operational continuity things that we have to be able to maintain. I think we've seen some of the things that we can stop doing in government during a disaster. It certainly creates inconvenience, but being able to maintain some of those critical, essential functions becomes really important for us. And then I think it comes down to the communication piece, making sure you're communicating up within your organization, across all levels of your organization, making sure anyone that has a touch point with your department, your company, that they understand what it is that you're doing, how things have changed because of the disaster, and what your plan is to maintain those critical operations and eventually reopen and restart your business.
So you've always got most of your ducks in a row and of course are always incredibly well prepared, but I'm wondering, like in any crisis or scenario, there's always some stuff that's kind of an unknown or something outside of one's control. And I'm wondering, for you individually, like what's really been keeping you up at night as it relates to COVID-19?
I mentioned planning, and we do a lot of planning, and we have a lot of plans on our shelves, and I'm sure you and your members and the folks that are listening to or viewing this presentation have plans. Plans are great, but we need to understand that plans, for the most part, are frameworks. Very rarely can we run a disaster according to a checklist. So it's important that we maintain a level of flexibility in our planning efforts, so that we don't get locked into what the plan says should be happening and what we should be doing. I think they serve as useful guideposts. But for something like this, like the coronavirus response, it's exceeded a lot of our planning expectations in a lot of ways. When we look at a Cascadia subduction zone type of response, one of our planning assumptions is we're going to have 46, 47 other states that are rushing in to help us. With something like this, a disaster that's impacted all 36 counties, all 9 tribes in the state of Oregon, and each of the 50 states, no one's coming to help us. So we've really kind of been on our own as every other state. So when you look at worst case scenario planning, you need to make sure that you're flexible and able to adjust and improvise and adapt a little bit. And that becomes really important. And improvising doesn't just mean making stuff up. I think a lot of folks, when they think of improvising, they think of just saying whatever comes up and just making things up without any kind of a framework. But when you really dive into what improvisation means, there are certainly guides and frameworks and rules, if you will, on how to do that. And it's about being flexible, taking inputs and letting those inputs affect how you're operating, and working towards common goals with your partners to collaborate. And it really comes down to the understanding that, generally speaking, the things that we can create together are much better than the things that we can create on our own. And that's a big part of improvisation for us. I think with this particular disaster, the one thing that keeps me up at night is certainly the evolving nature of this disaster, how slow it is. Typically in an emergency or disaster like a flood, the event happens and it's over, usually in a day or two, or maybe 3 or 4. But this, we're now 2-3 months into it, and we're still very much in a response mode. While we've initiated a lot of our recovery efforts, we're still actively responding to this disaster, and that can be incredibly burdensome for the staff, the teams, limited resources, and keeping focus on what's needed and not becoming too disaster fatigued is really, really important for me and our team, the entire team here in the state of Oregon. And I think if you try to look at this through the lens that we look at other disaster scenarios like an earthquake, I think my biggest concern at this point is this, using an earthquake metaphor, is this a foreshock? Is this just a small taste of what might be coming later in the fall or the winter? And how can we make sure that we're prepared and forward-leaning enough to be as responsive in the fall as we have been, I think, this past spring, certainly here in the state of Oregon. The final piece I think I want to add, as an emergency manager, as a former first responder, we always want to be part of the solution. We like to think that when we show up on the scene or when we start managing an incident, that we're able to stabilize things quickly and stop loss of suffering and economic impacts and the loss of life. When you look at a pandemic, it can be a hard pill to swallow that no matter how well we do our jobs, people are still gonna die from this. And that's a difficult thing to wrap your head around, no matter how many N95 masks we can get out on the street, no matter how well we socially distant ourselves or physically distant ourselves from each other and try to reduce the spread. And no matter how flat the curve gets, people are still dying, and that's a challenge.
Yeah, related to that, you mentioned earlier too some of the supply chain work that your office does, and I'm wondering, as it relates to personal protective equipment, how has the supply chain changed in the state in response to the COVID-19 crisis? And what do you recommend going forward, either for the state or for companies, as they're looking to prepare for that next emergency? You mentioned there could be another spike that's worse in the fall.
Yeah, the supply chain has been challenging on a number of fronts. I think we all saw the toilet paper shortages, whatever that was about, at the front end of this. And I think that was kind of that weak signal up front of how impactful a global pandemic can really be and how vulnerable a lot of our supply chains are. For us, on the emergency management response side, typically when we provide resource requests to our local partners or private industry that may need critical emergency resources to respond or to mitigate the impacts of a disaster, we work on kind of a pull method where a county will say, we'll reach out to the state and say, hey, I need 30,000 sandbags because we're having flooding. And there's a process for that. And we look at that and say, okay, Lane County, you need 30,000 sandbags. Have you checked privately with your suppliers to see if anything is available? Very often the answer is no. And we say, okay, well, have you checked with Douglas County and some of your neighboring counties to see if they have resources? If the answer is no, then we start working with state mechanisms to provide those resources. Because of the impacts to the personal protective equipment supply chain specifically, very early on in this disaster, we had to shift from that full message, or that full methodology where we were filling requests that were coming in from local partners and tribal partners, more of a push method where whenever we had state procurement or donations or federal pushes of supplies, we were quickly turning those around and pushing them out to the counties based on a formula that considered population of counties and number of cases in each county. That's not the most efficient way, I don't think, for us to do things during a disaster always, but given the criticality of that equipment and the challenges that our counties were having in procuring things and the emergent need of those supplies, I think it was the best way at that point to get this equipment out to the counties. Not as scientific as we would typically like, I don't think, but I think we had to find maybe a 60 or 70% solution as opposed to waiting and coming up with a 100% solution to overcome the challenges with the supply chains. I think when we look at disruptions, whether it's in the supply chain or workforce or other resources that we need to do our jobs, the communication piece becomes really, really important. Staff becomes anxious, communities we serve and customers become anxious about the stability of what it is that we're providing, whether it's a government service or a product or social services. Being able to communicate with your team, your customers, the people that you serve becomes really important towards limiting some of that anxiety. I would say it's incumbent upon anyone, especially if you're in a leadership position, to spend a little bit of time thinking about crisis communications and how you're going to communicate in a crisis, trying to display a level of empathy, understanding that you don't have all the answers and being upfront and frank when you don't have all the answers. This has been a really challenging experience for a lot of us because so much about this coronavirus is novel and new, and we didn't have a lot of answers, especially early on. So we're making the best decisions we could with limited information, and that's not a comfortable position for a lot of people to be in. We like to have focus groups and do test runs and pilot projects, but in an emergency or disaster, you don't have time for that. So you have to get really comfortable first making decisions with not as much information as you typically like, and second, being able to communicate what those decisions are, the impacts of those decisions, and the uncertainty around some of what's happening, and convey that even though we maybe don't have all of the answers right now, we're working to get those answers, acknowledging the importance of that information and why we're working to get it out to the public or to our partners, and being honest and clear about when you expect to be able to provide more detail and more information. I think that goes a long way towards building confidence within your staff and your employees, as well as public trust. I think the other piece for me has been the importance of maintaining a level of flexibility. We can't be too rigid when we're working in a crisis. Very early on in my career, I had an exercise with the hospital for an active assailant type of an incident, and as luck would have it, the morning of the exercise, two of the ambulances that we were going to use as part of the exercise had to get called into service for real-world incidents. So we used a transport van to take these fictional victims to a hospital. Well, normally during an active assailant type of an incident, there's a lot of communication between the ambulance and the hospital before those patients would show up at a hospital. Well, because we were transporting them in a bus or a van, there wasn't that level of communication. So all of a sudden, we had 17 patients show up unannounced at a hospital. And the hospital administration wanted to cancel the exercise, saying, well, wait a second, we didn't get notified these were even coming. There's no communication. This is unrealistic. I said, well, actually, it's fairly realistic because in an active assailant situation, people will be transported to your facility in private vehicles and police cars and by other means, and you won't have that communication. So how are you going to handle that? It was kind of an aha moment, I think, for the hospital and for me to understand plans are great, but being able to be a little bit flexible and dynamic and allow whatever it is that's being presented to inform what it is you're doing and how you're responding becomes really, really important. So working on the crisis communication piece and working on our ability to be flexible and dynamic in dynamic environments is really, I think, a hallmark of being able to lead during a disaster like this or any other event.
You mentioned the scenario where like a single event typically that you're preparing for happens in a matter of days, or it could be hours, right, and then it's over. And then other states aren't impacted and they can provide additional support. In this case, we have a lot of states all getting impacted at the same time, but also at different points in time. So Washington was kind of early on, a little bit ahead of Oregon. It spiked quicker. We have collaboration going on now on the West Coast between Washington, California, and Oregon. And I'm wondering, to what extent are there any sort of best practices that you've been able to kind of benefit from those arrangements? Like, how has that coordination across the West Coast been going, and where do you see it going next?
So I think we're definitely much more aligned with our West Coast partners and even Idaho and Nevada and some of our other Western states with how we want to start easing some of the restrictions and getting folks back out into their communities. Certainly much more alignment than how it was when the pandemic first hit. And quite frankly, we were all at the state level making just the best decisions that we could and trying to do whatever we thought we could to minimize the impact to our communities while also weighing the needs of our economies. I think for me, the one lesson learned, and there's going to be quite the after-action report, I think, when all is said and done, and most of us, I think, are keeping notebooks full of things that we need to work on and areas for improvement, and some successes that we've had that we need to build on. I think for me, and here in Oregon, one of the lessons that we've learned is how much a part of the solution everyday Oregonians want to be. We were pretty overwhelmed, quite frankly, at the start of this when we announced that if you had PPE you wanted to donate, or a service you wanted to provide, or you wanted to volunteer or offer your business to be part of the solution to our response, we couldn't keep up with the emails, the onslaught of emails that we were getting to that request. We really didn't know, or maybe underestimated the generosity and the willingness to pitch in from Oregonians. We had to pivot pretty quickly to a much more robust platform to capture people who wanted to provide goods, services, donations, volunteer, to be part of the solution. And I think one of the disaster myths that we see repeated in the news about things like the Cascadia event, for example, is that society will break down after a big disaster and chaos will reign. This has been as impactful of a disaster as our state, I think, has experienced to date, and maybe outside of the Cascadia, the most impactful disaster we'll ever experience. So to see Oregonians come together, pitch in, being good neighbors, checking on each other, not coming out in droves, adding to the problems, but we're really trying to find ways to be part of the solution and understanding that there's a public benefit to be gained by doing some of what Governor Brown has asked Oregonians to do was really impressive. I think it was a wake-up call too for a lot of folks about individual and community preparedness. No one liked the thought of being without toilet paper for a couple of days. As we start hearing about potential supply chain disruptions from our meat producers, no one likes the thought of heading into Memorial Day barbecue season without burgers and hot dogs and bratwurst to fill in the grill. So I think it's been an important opportunity for us to review how we prepare individually, how we prepare as communities, and some of the things that we need to be prepared for as we have shocks and stressors to our systems from other disasters, not just the pandemic. I think there's been a lot of weak signals, if you will, from this particular disaster that can be applied across the board to other disasters. One is the collaboration and communication piece, how we plug into the private sector, how we integrate state agencies that we don't necessarily normally work with or partner with, and the importance of getting communication out to all levels of government and private partners in the communities that we serve to be able to make those decisions for themselves and their families. But one of the challenges, I think, with this disaster that we don't have in other disasters is the social distancing piece. We are pack animals in a lot of ways, and we like to be surrounded by our friends, our family, especially in times of crisis. And here at the Office of Emergency Management, with all the state partners we work with, we love to come together in a big room and work together to solve problems. That hasn't been practical for this for a lot of reasons. It's been challenging, I think, to overcome some of those barriers and not have the familiarity of sitting next to the person that you typically work with on disaster response, having to do things like Zoom meetings and collaboration and coordination over the telephone, text messages, email, et cetera. It's been a challenge and a learning curve. But I think in some ways it shows that in challenging environments, whether there's no communications because of an earthquake, or the inability to bring a lot of folks together to solve problems, we can adapt and overcome. And it's important, I think, that we document some of the processes that we've used now that will pay benefits and dividends when we have the Cascadia suggestions on earthquake.
That's great. So we got the signal that we're at about the 5-minute warning mark. And there was one question we got from the audience that was sort of ahead of time, ahead of the call. And specifically is around resiliency and disaster planning as it relates to mass transit. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a little bit about some of the thoughts around how the state is approaching that, whether from a single event that's really finite in time, or whether something like we're currently facing with social distancing, where it's really challenging for folks to rely on mass transit the way they once did, 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, mass transit's a really important piece of our economy, especially when it comes to vulnerable populations and their ability to get around their communities. I think one of the things that we'll hear a little bit more detailed about in the governor's reopening plan is the importance of protecting our mass care and mass transit workers, ensuring that they have a really high level of protection as they're back on the jobs, but also messaging to the public the need to limit travel to sort of those essential trips. We don't want folks crowding on mass transit if they don't absolutely have to. Trying to keep that infrastructure as safe as possible, not just for the people that will be using it, but for the workers that we rely on to manage those systems and keep our communities and our economy running. So we're really developing a lot of sector-specific guidance, and the transit sector is one of the key components of that reopening plan. We need to make sure that foundational piece of infrastructure is up and running and those workers are protected as we continue to work towards the reopening through the summer.
Great. And we've been asking the same question of all of our featured guests, a little bit more lighthearted than disasters. It's what's been your most awkward experience to date, either personally or other people in your network, in terms of this virtual environment we now find ourselves in? You mentioned a lot of Zoom calls. Any awkward or embarrassing moments?
There's been the typical dog barking in the background, kids running behind the screen, not knowing how to unmute yourself, things like that. But it hasn't had too many things that'll go viral, I don't think, on social media that I've been involved in, or major faux pas. I'm pretty active on social media, so I like to view and live vicariously through the goofs and embarrassing moments of others, I think.
Nice.
So that's been pretty fortunate from my end. There's been a lot of opportunities, I think, for me to be out in public with press conferences and everything else, and I don't think I need any more exposure of doing something goofy on the Zoom call. So that's been helpful.
That's good. I love your idea of I can enjoy and live vicariously through the gaffes of others.
Absolutely. It's a good chuckle during something like this is really important to keep folks spirits up. So I appreciate all people doing goofy things.
Yes. Well, I'm really glad you're able to take some time out of your incredibly busy schedule to spend with us this morning, and I know our members really appreciated it too. So wish you all the best for the weekend, and we're really pleased that we have such a steady hand at the helm during this crisis. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And I look forward to addressing any questions that popped up that we didn't get to today.
Sounds great. And a big thank you to Peggy Miller and Packstar for all their support, and for all of you for joining us this morning. Thank you.